MISC, multisystemic inflammatory syndrome in children. I'm sure every single parent out there has heard of this. And I'm sure some of you parents are wondering, like, well, how serious is this? Do I need to pull my kid out of school? Do we need to hunker down because now my kid is going to be at risk? What are these new viruses? And are they going to be really hurting kids in a way that we've never seen before, right? These are all the questions that are probably going through your mind. And it may be causing a whole lot of stress, a whole lot of worry, and I don't blame you. Let's look at this. Let's really, really look at this to understand what this thing is, how awful it is, how worried you need to be, and should you be doing something or not. So this awful inflammatory syndrome, this condition, happens after a child gets COVID, and on top of having fevers that go on for a very, very long time, they start having intense vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea. They start developing weird rashes. Heavens forbid, they go into heart failure. They go into kidney failure because their immune system attacks the heart and kidneys on top of other organs, and 30 kids have died from this awful condition. Over 2,000 kids have ended up in the hospital, most of them in the ICU because of this. It's not a joke. This is a serious condition, and it is awful. If I was a parent whose child had this condition, I would lose my mind. I would lose my mind. I don't know what I would do. But let's stand back for a second. Let's stand back for a second and kind of take the emotionality out of this and just look at some raw data to get perspective. First of all, when we say 2,000 kids have been hospitalized and 30 kids have died, out of how many kids have these 2,000 been ultimately the ones that have suffered? There's about 70 million kids in the United States, and I think if we're being conservative, we can say that somewhere around 10%. Some would say, it's probably more, but let's say 10%, just to be conservative. We don't know the true number. Let's say 10% of all kids in the United States have gotten COVID. So that means that there's 7 million kids who have gotten COVID. So if we put 2,000 and divide it by 7 million, and you do the math for yourself, what number does that give you? Pretty low number, right? It's a pretty low number, which all of a sudden has you say like, that means that a lot of kids actually do absolutely fine and don't end up with this horrible outcome. But let's zoom further out because there's actually more information to consider and then in looking at this and understanding the context of this illness. Did you know that prior to COVID, somewhere around 2,500 to 5,000 kids per year developed another serious inflammatory condition called Kawasaki's? And Kawasaki's syndrome is basically this horrible condition. We don't totally understand exactly why it happens. There are studies that suggest that other viruses trigger it. There are studies that talk about potentially other bacteria or other microbes or other environmental factors trigger it. But nonetheless, prior to COVID, between 2,500 and 5,000 kids were having other serious systemic inflammatory conditions that were landing them in the hospital, sometimes in the ICU because of the severity of it. Let's zoom even further out. Did you know that prior to COVID, somewhere around 45,000 kids were hospitalized per year due to the flu? Did you know prior to COVID, over 600 kids were dying from the flu? That didn't make the headlines in the New York Times, right? That wasn't landing on your feed because we called it normal. We just said, well, that's just a part of life, right? Kids die, which is horrible to say. As a pediatrician and as a dad, like, I'm not saying these words lightly. Any death of any child is horrific. And part of why I do everything I do is to make sure that no kid under my watch, and hopefully as part of our community, we do everything possible to protect all the kids. That's why I'm taking all this time to share with you information that can help you keep your kid as healthy as possible. But 600 kids per year were dying from the flu. So now when these 30 kids have died from COVID, this is a really big deal, but that wasn't a big deal. Folks, perspective is important. As you're considering, do I need to pull my kid out of school? Do we need to hunker down and socially isolate so my kid has no exposure to COVID? When you start looking at these numbers, 2,000 over 7 million, 2,000 over 2,500 to 5,000, 2,000 over 45,000, you start realizing like, hey, this MISC is serious and we don't totally understand it. It could be that there's a new variant of COVID that's causing issues and we're going to see more of it. That's all possible. I'm not discounting any of this. I'm not saying anyone should be stupid about how they act. I'm not saying anyone should be irresponsible. I'm not saying you should do anything to put yourself or your family in harm's way. I'm not saying any of that. What I am saying is that perhaps you take a stand back and you just take a nice deep breath and hold that knowing that your kid is going to be okay. That it's okay for them to go to school. That it's okay for them to be out there in whatever way that you think it is safe. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not here to say, you know what, this is the right answer and everyone needs to be putting their kid in school. No. Only you know what is right for your family. Only you know what is right for your child. Only you know what is safe for your family unit. And I'm not here to argue that in any way. But I am here to say maybe we shouldn't be living in a state of fear. Maybe you shouldn't be completely stressed out and worried over this condition at this time, given what we know. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this condition is when you start looking at it now from the holistic kind of functional medicine lens, a really interesting picture comes to light, which is something, it's a hypothesis at this point. We don't really know. But for those of you that had the chance to watch my discussion with Dr. Elroy Vojdani, or for those of you that actually looked at his article, one of the things that they published is that COVID plays a really nasty part in causing gut inflammation. So it attacks the zonulin proteins. What are the zonulin proteins? They're basically the glue that keeps our intestinal integrity whole. So COVID hits this glue and causes the cells to come apart, which causes essentially what we call leaky gut. When we get leaky gut, when we get an intense inflammatory response in the gut, what happens? You get vomiting, you get diarrhea, you get severe abdominal pain. Does that sound familiar? What happens when gut integrity is compromised? This is actually well known in the functional medicine world. You start getting all kinds of weird dermatologic reactions because the gut actually mediates the immune system, which then influences everything else. Vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, rashes, MISC, gut integrity, COVID, we know that. Guess what happens when the immune system goes completely bonkers due to gut inflammation? It starts attacking anything and everything from other organs to other systems, and ultimately things can collapse. We don't know this for sure. The CDC certainly hasn't come out to say that this is the case. But when you look at the data that is out there, all of a sudden this weird condition that's happening in kids starts making some sense. What can you do if this hypothesis is correct? Get your kids some probiotics. Probiotics, we know, help downregulate the inflammatory response in the gut. We know that probiotics can help prevent intestinal permeability issues. If you want to get really fancy, take some colostrum-based products, and there's a ton of them out there. Immune globulins, when taken orally, can actually downregulate the inflammatory response. They can prevent and heal intestinal permeability that is a result of some kind of insult. Make sure your kid is eating well. Try to cut out whatever junk you can. Minimize the sugar. Give them vegetables if they're willing to eat them. Nourish their gut, because you know what? That is how we can protect against this. You're not high and dry. We've talked about this before. You're not just stuck and this is just inevitable and it's going to happen and the end of the world is coming. There are things we can do. And once we start looking at things and saying, God, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, rash, immune activation. Maybe it is the gut, because you know what? 60% of the time in vulnerable individuals, the COVID virus can actually hit the gut and it can compromise intestinal permeability. We know that. So let's do things to prevent that. And you know what? Taking a probiotic and colostrum and eating well, there's no harm in that. If your kid doesn't need it, you haven't done any harm. You've only made them healthier. And I hope that these are conversations we can have instead of doom and gloom is coming and darkness is coming and life is over and you must be stressed out and you must live in fear. We turn this around and say, you know what? This awful thing is happening. One, it's not that common, so please don't be stressed. And I hope the New York Times blasts information like this. Don't be stressed. Don't live in fear. And take some action steps, whatever is appropriate, to build up your gut, to build up your kid's gut, to optimize their health. Because you know what? Only good things can come from that. I hope this information is helpful. I hope this conversation is helpful. And I thank you all for watching. This is Dr. K. Be well.